You are no longer welcome. Leave this house and never come back.
But you're about to lose far more.
I want to tell you this story slowly, because if I rush it, you'll miss the part that matters. Everyone thinks this is a story about revenge. It isn't. It's a story about the exact moment a person stops asking to be understood and starts building something no one can touch. My name is Simone Okafor Reyes, though for most of my life I was just Robert's daughter, the quiet one, the one who didn't cause trouble, the one who worked in the back office of the family construction business in Inglewood while my younger brother, Devin, got his name on the building. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it explains everything that comes after. Devin's name was literally cast in bronze above the entrance. Mine wasn't anywhere. That Tuesday started like any other. I got to the office at 7:40, same as always, coffee in hand, laptop bag over my shoulder. I'd been running the financial modeling for Reyes and Sons development for 6 years. The permits, the investor decks, the actual numbers that kept the company from collapsing twice. My father, Robert Reyes, built the company with his hands in the 90s. By the time I came into it, it ran on spreadsheets, not concrete, and I was the one who understood both. I should tell you about the office itself, because it says something about how things worked. It was a converted warehouse in Inglewood, exposed brick, the kind of space that photographs well for a company newsletter. My desk was in the back corner, near the server closet, no window. Devin's desk, which he used maybe 3 days a week, sat by the front windows, close enough to my father's office that they could talk without either of them getting up. I used to tell myself the corner desk didn't mean anything. Proximity isn't hierarchy. I'd say to myself, like a mantra, well, I built the 30-tab spreadsheet that told my father whether he could make payroll. Growing up, the pattern was already there. I just didn't have language for it yet. Devin got a car for his 16th birthday. A used Civic, sure, but a car. I got a we'll see how the year goes that somehow never resolved into anything with wheels. When Devin failed out of his first semester of college, my father called it finding himself. When I turned down a full ride to a school 4 hours away because I didn't want to leave my mother alone during her chemotherapy. My father told me I was making excuses. I carried that sentence around for over a decade, like a stone in my shoe. I'd almost forgotten how much it had worn down that particular part of me, until the Slack invite reminded me all over again. There's a version of this story where I tell you I saw it coming, where I frame myself as some quiet strategist who'd anticipated every move. That wouldn't be honest. The truth is I love that company the way you love something you built, with your own hands, even when it wasn't yours to build. I used to stay late just to walk the finished units before the new tenants moved in, running my palm along a countertop I'd fought for in a budget meeting, standing in an empty living room imagining the family who'd eventually fill it with noise. I believed stubbornly that if I just kept being indispensable, my father would eventually see me the way he saw Devin, not because Devin had earned it, because I hadn't yet accepted that earning was never actually the criterion. I found out I was being replaced from a Slack message, not from my father, not even from HR, from a calendar invite that CC'd me by accident. Devin, transition meeting, Simone's role restructuring. I remember staring at my monitor so long the screen dimmed. I walked into my father's office without knocking, which I never did. He was on the phone, but he saw my face and hung up. "You're restructuring my role," I said. Not a question. He didn't flinch. That's the part that still gets me. He didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. "Devin's ready to take more ownership. You'll still have a place here, just a smaller one." I built the debt models that got us the Crenshaw project financed. I built the projections that convinced the bank not to pull our line of credit in 2021. What exactly has Devin built? "He's my son," my father said, like that was an answer instead of the absence of one. "I'm your daughter," I said, and I heard how small it sounded, how much it sounded like a child's argument, and I hated that I'd let myself sound that way in a room where I'd spent 6 years being nothing but precise. "Don't make this about that," he said. "This is business. It's always business when it's convenient for you, and always family when it's not," I said. "You used my numbers to secure the Crenshaw financing and told the bank I was part of the family. Team, you used my face in the company brochure under Our People. You didn't think it was business then." He rubbed his jaw, the way he did when he was deciding whether to be honest or just wait me out. He chose to wait me out. That was always his preferred strategy, not to win an argument, but to outlast it, the way water outlasts stone. Devin has a family to think about now, he finally said. Amber's pregnant. He needs a title that means something, for the loans, for his self-respect. You understand. I did understand, actually. I understood completely. What I understood was that my father had run the numbers on which child's dignity was negotiable, and he'd landed, without apparent difficulty, on mine. I want to be clear, I wasn't naive. I'd watched Devin coast for years, watched my father excuse his missed deadlines and blown budgets as he's still learning. I had made peace with being underestimated at work. What I hadn't made peace with, what I don't think I ever let myself fully feel until that Slack message, was that being underestimated wasn't an accident. It was the plan. It had always been the plan. That night I went to my father's house for what I thought would be a normal Sunday dinner. Moved up early. An attempt, maybe, to smooth things over before they got worse. Instead, my stepmother Vivian had already boxed up the few things I still kept in my old bedroom, the one they let me use when I stayed over after long site visits. My suitcase was on the porch before I even parked. "You're an adult, Simone," my father said, standing in the doorway like a man delivering a eulogy he'd rehearsed. "It's time you stood on your own. Devin needs the company. You'll figure something out. You always do. You always do." As if my competence was the reason it was safe to discard me. Vivian stood behind him in the hallway light, arms crossed, saying nothing, which was its own kind of statement. She had never liked me, not really. Not since she married my father, 2 years after my mother died, and I think some part of her had been waiting for this evening for a long time. I could see it in the small, satisfied set of her mouth. I wondered, standing there, whether she'd suggested boxing up my room, or whether that particular cruelty had been all my father's own idea. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that, because I think people expect the crying to come first. It didn't. What came first was something colder and clearer. The recognition that I had spent 6 years proving my value to, someone who had already decided, long before I proved anything, exactly how much space I was allowed to take up. You cannot argue someone into valuing you. I knew that intellectually. Standing on that porch, I finally knew it in my body. 2, a kind of knowing that settles into your spine and doesn't leave. I picked up my suitcase. It was heavier than I remembered, though nothing had been added to it. My father actually said, "Don't make this dramatic. You'll land on your feet, you always do." I said nothing. I got in my car and I drove. Past the cul-de-sac where I'd learned to ride a bike. Past the church where we'd held my mother's funeral. Past all the small landmarks of a childhood that I was only now, at 31, starting to see clearly for what it had actually been. Here's the thing my father didn't know. Here's the thing almost no one knew. 3 years earlier, after a bitter fight with him over a project he'd nearly tanked by ignoring my numbers, I'd quietly started something of my own. Not a competing construction company. I wasn't trying to prove a point in his industry. I'd used my savings, a small inheritance from my mother, who passed when I was 24, and a group of investors I'd met through my MBA program to start a boutique real estate holding fund. Nothing flashy. No press releases. I called it Ashgrove Capital, and I ran it entirely under my mother's maiden name, Okafor, specifically so it would never cross my father's radar. He barely acknowledged my mother's side of the family existed. It never occurred to him to look there. Ashgrove had spent those 3 years quietly acquiring distressed coastal properties, homes owners couldn't finish renovating, estates tied up in probate, one particularly beautiful modernist house in Malibu that had gone through 2 bankrupt owners before we picked it up for a fraction of its worth. The first time I walked through it with Denise, half the windows were boarded, the pool was a green pit, and a family of raccoons had taken up residence in what would become the primary suite. I remember standing in that ruined kitchen, coffee going cold in my hand, and feeling something I hadn't felt at Reyes & Sons in years. The quiet, uncomplicated satisfaction of building something that was entirely mine to lose or keep. We restored it slowly, carefully, using contractors I trusted completely. Contractors. Ironically, I'd first met through Reyes & Sons, men and women who knew exactly who my father was and never once thought to mention his daughter was quietly outbidding, hedge funds up and down the coast under a different name. Ashgrove's portfolio, By the time I stood on that porch with my suitcase in hand, held 11 properties. The Malibu house on Ocotillo Drive was the one I loved most. The one Denise and I had privately started calling the real house. As if the rest of my life had only ever been a rough draft. I hadn't told my father because for years, some small, stubborn part of me wanted to earn my place at his company honestly, not silence him with a bank statement. I told myself I was protecting Ashgrove's privacy, protecting my investors, protecting the deal flow. All true and all underneath an excuse. What I actually wanted, if I'm honest with you the way I haven't been honest with anyone else, was for my father to choose me on his own. No leverage, no reveal, no evidence. Just him deciding, freely, that I mattered. I see now how foolish that wanting was. You cannot earn your way into a place in someone's heart that was never built with room for you. Some doors were never locked. They were simply never built into the wall in the first place. So that night, driving away from the house with my suitcase still smelling like the cedar drawers, Vivian had dumped my clothes out of, I didn't call a friend. I didn't call Devin, who I imagine was already celebrating over drinks. I called my property manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise, who'd been overseeing the Malibu house renovation for the final 6 months. "Is the main house move-in ready?" I asked her. There was a pause. "The Ocotillo Drive property? Simona, it's done. Furniture's in, staging crew finished last week. Why?" "Because I'm coming home," I said. And for the first time all day, my voice shook. Not from grief, from something closer to disbelief at my own life. I drove through the night, through Inglewood, through the 10, up the coast highway as the dark ocean unrolled beside me like something patient, something that had been waiting. I didn't put on music. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, and somewhere around Santa Monica, I noticed my hands had stopped shaking on the wheel. And somewhere around Topanga, I noticed I was, without quite meaning to, smiling, not from happiness exactly, but from the strange, vertiginous relief of a door finally, irreversibly closing behind me. Around 5 a.m., the sky started turning that pale bruised color right before sunrise, and I pulled up to the gate of a house with an address that, on paper, belonged to a corporation with my mother's maiden name buried 3 layers deep in the ownership structure. The gate recognized my plate before I even reached for my phone. It swung open slowly, almost politely, the way a door opens for someone it's been expecting. I parked the rolls I'd bought used at auction. 18 months earlier, another thing Robert Reyes never knew existed, because I never drove it anywhere near him, keeping it garaged 3 miles from Ashgrove's office like evidence. I wasn't ready to submit. I stepped out in the same blazer and slacks. I'd worn to what I thought was going to be an ordinary Tuesday, dragging a suitcase up the drive of a $50 million house that had my name, my real name, the one that actually mattered, quietly written into every deed, every LLC, every wire transfer that had built it plank by plank, permit by permit, over 3 secret years. Denise had left the front lights on for me, low and warm, spilling out onto the stone path. Through the tall glass doors, I could see the great room she and I had, argued over for a month, the placement of a single charcoal sectional, the exact shade of white oak for the floors, arguments that had felt, at the time, almost absurdly luxurious, the kind of problems only a person building a real life gets to have. I stood there a long moment before I went inside, not because I was proud, because I understood, standing on that stone path with the Pacific turning gold behind me, that everything my father thought he knew about who I was had just become instantly, permanently obsolete. And he didn't even know it yet. I went inside and I didn't unpack. I sat on the edge of a bed in a room I owned outright, still in my work clothes, and watched the sun come all the way up over water that belonged to no one. And I let myself feel, finally, the full weight of what had happened. Not the anger, not yet, just the plain, exhausting grief of realizing your father built you a smaller life on purpose. I slept for 11 hours. When I woke, there were 4 missed calls from Devin. None from my father, and 1 voicemail from Denise that I almost didn't open, because her voice, in the first 3 seconds, sounded like someone delivering news she didn't want to be the one delivering. "Simone," she said, "I need you to call me back the second you hear this. It's about the buyer for the Okafor Coastal Portfolio. Inquiry, the one from 8 months ago. He just resurfaced. Except this time, he's not calling about our portfolio." She paused long enough that I could hear her exhale. "He's asking about Reyes and Sons. Simone, I think your father is trying to sell the company. And I think he's about to sell it to someone who already knows exactly who you are. I sat very still on the edge of that unfamiliar, beautiful bed, phone against my ear, and felt the last piece of the last 6 years click quietly into place. Every late night, every unpaid extra hour, every time I'd told myself I was building goodwill instead of just building a business. None of it had bought me what I thought it was buying. My father hadn't kept me close because he valued me. He'd kept me close because I was useful. Right up until the moment I became inconvenient, and now he was preparing to sell the very thing I'd spent 6 years holding together, to a man who had sat across a conference table from me 8 months earlier and shaken my hand under a name my father had never once bothered to learn. I thought about calling my father right then. I thought about warning him, some old, stubborn loyalty flickering even now, even after the suitcase, even after the porch. Then I thought about Vivian's small, satisfied smile in that hallway light, and Devon's 4 missed calls that weren't even for me. They were probably about the company he now realized he couldn't run alone, and I put the phone down on the nightstand instead. He had no idea we already knew each other. I called Denise back within 90 seconds, and I want you to know that my voice was steady. Not because I felt steady, because I'd learned a long time ago, sitting across from bankers who assumed the woman with the spreadsheet was somebody's assistant, that the steadiness in your voice is the first asset anyone actually respects. Before Denise even finished her sentence, I was already up, pulling a legal pad from the desk in the study, a habit from years of late nights at Reyes & Sons, where I'd learned that panic organizes itself faster on paper than it does in your head. I wrote 3 words at the top. What do I actually know? Underneath it, I started listing everything, the way I would for any client, any deal, stripping the whole mess of my own history down to facts I could verify. Tell me everything, I said. Slowly, Denise laid it out the way she laid out everything. Clean, sequenced, no editorializing. 8 months earlier, Ashgrove Capital had been approached by a coastal development firm called Voss Meridian about a potential joint acquisition of 3 distressed properties along the PCH corridor. I'd sat in that meeting myself, in a gray blazer under the name Simone Okafor, shaking hands with the firm's founder, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Adrian Voss who'd built his reputation, buying up land nobody else wanted and turning it into land everybody suddenly did. We hadn't closed a deal with him. His terms were aggressive, and I didn't like how quickly he wanted control of the entity structure, but we'd stayed in touch, the way you do with people you respect but don't yet trust. Now, according to Denise's source, a title officer who worked deals for both Ashgrove and, unknowingly, for Reyes & Sons, Adrian, Voss had opened a due diligence file on my father's company 2 weeks earlier. Not a partnership, an acquisition. Full buyout, including the name. The backlog of permits. And this was the detail that actually made my stomach drop, the outstanding line of credit my father had personally guaranteed against the house he still lived in. The house where 3 days earlier he'd set my suitcase on the porch. He's underwater, Denise said quietly. Simone Reyes & Sons has been underwater for at least a year. The Crenshaw project barely broke even. There's a bridge loan coming due in 90 days that I don't think Devon even knows exists. I asked her to send me whatever the title officer had been willing to share, and by that evening I had a redacted set of loan documents spread across the dining table of a house that suddenly felt too quiet for the size of what I was reading. My father had taken a personal guarantee against the Inglewood house, the house I'd grown up in, the one with the cul-de-sac and the driveway where he'd once refused to buy me a car, to cover a shortfall from a project I remembered clearly, a mixed-use development in Baldwin, hills that had gone 11 months over schedule because he'd overruled my cost projections and trusted a contractor's promise instead of my numbers. I had flagged that exact risk in a memo 2 years earlier. He'd forwarded my memo to Devon instead of reading it himself, with a note that said only, "See attached, handle if needed." Devon had never opened it. I found that out later, and somehow that detail, not the debt, not the betrayal, just that small, absent gesture, was the one that actually made my hands shake reading it. I sat with that for a long moment, looking out at water so calm it looked painted on. My father had spent 6 years letting me build the numbers that kept his company breathing, and at some point, I still don't know exactly when, he'd started hiding the numbers from me too, which meant the restructuring wasn't really about making room for Devon's growing family. It was about needing someone in that back office who wouldn't ask the questions I would have asked. Devin wouldn't notice a hole in the balance sheet if you handed him a flashlight and pointed. That, I understood now, was the entire point of putting him there. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the daughter feels vindicated the second she learns her father is drowning. I didn't feel that. I felt something closer to grief, layered over the anger, the way silt settles under moving water. My father wasn't choosing Devin over me because he believed in Devin more. He was choosing the son he could still control over the daughter who'd started, quietly, to see too clearly. I called Adrian Voss myself 2 days later. Not as Ashgrove, not hidden behind any structure. I called as Simone Reyes, the woman he'd known for 8 months as someone else entirely. He was quiet on the line for a full 3 seconds after I told him who my father was. Then he laughed, short and startled, the kind of laugh that means a puzzle has just solved itself. "You're Robert Reyes's daughter," he said. "The one he's selling out from under. I'm the woman who did the modeling that convinced you Ashgrove was worth partnering with," I said. "I'd like to know what you're offering him, and I'd like the chance to make you a better offer before he signs anything." There was a long pause. "Why would I do that?" He came to me. "He's motivated. Motivated sellers are good for buyers." "Because," I said, "he doesn't know what he's actually selling you. And you don't either. Half his active permits are tied to project financials I built. If I walk away from those models, and believe me, I will, the moment his signature is on your contract, you'll spend 18 months untangling a mess he doesn't even know is a mess. Or you and I structure something cleaner. Something where the value doesn't quietly disappear the day the deal closes." I could hear him thinking. That's a specific kind of silence, the sound of a smart person recalculating. "What exactly are you proposing?" he finally asked. "Ashgrove acquires the operating entity. In partnership with Voss Meridian, at fair value based on real numbers, not whatever number my father's panic has talked him down to. I retain operational control of Reyes and Sons for 18 months to protect the existing projects, and the people working under them, the actual construction crews, not my father. You get your coastal footprint. I get to make sure 6 years of work doesn't get sold off at a discount to cover a hole. My father created and hid from everyone, including his own son. And your father? My father gets a fair market payout for his equity. Nothing punitive. Nothing dramatic, just what the company is actually worth paid to him honestly, which is more consideration than he's shown me in 6 years." Adrian Voss went quiet again, and then he said something I still think about. "You're not trying to burn it down." "No," I said. "I already have a house. I don't need his to fall to feel like I have somewhere to stand." We closed the structure in 11 days, faster than anything I'd worked on in my life. Partly because Adrian moved with the same clean decisiveness I recognized in myself, and partly because my father, once he understood Ashgrove Capital and Simone, Okafor and his own daughter were the same person, standing between him and a much worse deal, stopped fighting almost immediately. I think some small, buried part of him was almost relieved. It's a strange thing to watch a person's face do that. The fear and the shame and something that might have been pride all moving across it at once, like weather. Vivian called me twice during those 11 days. I let both calls go to voicemail, but I listened to them, sitting on the terrace, with the phone against my ear, like it was something dangerous I needed to inspect before deciding whether to handle it. The first message was mostly noise, accusations that I was punishing. My father, that I'd always been jealous of Devin, that I was just like my mother, thinking you're better than everyone. The second, left an hour later, was quieter, almost calculating, an offer, if you could call it that, to work something out between us. If I kept Vivian's own name off any documentation of what my father owed. I didn't call her back. There are people in a story like this who are never actually asking for peace. They're asking to keep whatever version of the story lets them stay comfortable. And I'd spent enough of my life managing other people's comfort at my own expense. He came to see me exactly once during that 11 days, at the house on Ocotillo Drive. I hadn't invited him. Denise let him through the gate because he stood there long enough that she didn't know what else to do. He stood in the entryway of a house he'd never known existed, looking at floors and windows, and a view he couldn't have afforded even at the height of Reyes and Sons, and he didn't say anything for almost a full minute. "I built this while you were deciding I wasn't worth a name on the building," I said. "I'm not telling you that to hurt you. I'm telling you because I need you to understand. I didn't do any of this out of spite. I did it because 6 years ago I stopped waiting for you to decide I mattered, and I started making sure it wouldn't depend on you anymore. I thought I was protecting the family, he said. Protecting Devin. He doesn't have what you have. He never did. Then you should have protected him honestly, I said. Not by hollowing me out to prop him up. You could have told him the truth years ago. You could have let him fail smaller, learn something, build his own version of confidence instead of borrowing mine without asking. Instead, you spent 6 years teaching him that someone else will always catch him. And you spent 6 years teaching me that no one would. He didn't argue with that. That was the strangest part. The man who'd never once, in 31 years, run out of reasons for why things were the way they were, simply stood in my kitchen and had none. What happens to me? He finally asked. And I understood hearing it, that this was the real question underneath everything else he'd said. You get paid fairly for the company you built. You get to keep your house, the one on the hill, the one you put my suitcase in front of, and you get to watch your daughter run the thing you built better than you were running it, from a house you didn't know she owned, under a name you never bothered to learn. I paused. That's not a punishment, Dad. That's just what's true now. He left without saying much else. Vivian, I later heard, was furious the deal hadn't collapsed entirely, hadn't left them with nothing, and I found a strange, quiet satisfaction in the fact that even my father's own wife had wanted more blood than I did. Devin called me the week after the deal closed. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, I didn't know about the loan, about any of it. I thought I was finally getting my chance, and I didn't ask a single question about what I was actually stepping into. I know, I said, and I meant it. Devin's failure had never really been ambition. It was that no one had ever required anything real of him, and by the time someone finally did, he had no muscle built for the weight of it. Can you teach me? He asked. Not hand me anything, teach me. If you'll let me learn it for real this time. I thought about the Slack invite. I thought about the porch, the suitcase, Vivian's small, satisfied smile in the hallway light. And then I thought about what actually mattered, underneath all of it, that I hadn't built Ash Grove, hadn't restored that broken house on Ocotillo Drive plank by plank, hadn't survived a childhood of being quietly unseen, just to become someone who repeated my father's exact mistake in the opposite direction, hoarding what I knew instead of sharing it, punishing a person for the sins of someone who'd raised him to expect rescue. Monday, I said. 8 a.m., don't be late. And Devin, I'm not doing this so you owe me anything. I'm doing it because somebody should have done it for both of us a long time ago, and it's not going to be our father. He showed up that Monday 12 minutes early, which was, in its own small way, the first real thing he'd ever done to earn a place at that table. I put him on the Baldwin Hills file first, the one that had started all of it, and I watched him read my old memo, the one he'd never opened, line by line, his jaw tightening slightly with each page. The way a person's face changes when they finally see the shape of something they'd been standing inside without knowing it. He didn't apologize for not reading it years ago. He didn't need to. He just asked better questions than I'd ever heard him ask, and kept asking them every week, for months afterward. I won't tell you he became a different person overnight. People rarely do. But he became someone who was, for the first time in his life, actually trying. And it turns out I had more patience for that than I expected to. I stood on the terrace that night, the one that looked straight down the coastline, toward the lights of the city where I grew up, small and unseen. And I thought about something my mother used to say, near the end, when the chemotherapy had taken almost everything except her clarity. She'd say it from her hospital bed, hand thin and cool in mine, in the same steady voice she'd used my whole childhood to make impossible. Things sound survivable. Simone, the people who decide you're small are usually just describing the size of the room they're willing to give you. It was never a measurement of you. I hadn't understood that sentence when she said it. I'd thought it was the kind of thing dying mothers say to comfort daughters who are about to be left behind, a gentle myth to hold on to. It took me 7 more years, a company I built in secret, and a suitcase on a porch to understand she hadn't been comforting me at all. She'd been handing me the only inheritance that would actually matter. Long before the house, long before Ash Grove, long before any of it. The fact that a room's size was never the measure of the person standing in it. I understood that sentence fully for the first time. Standing on a terrace that belonged to me, in a house nobody handed me, built from a name my father never thought to look for. Betrayal doesn't destroy you. It just finally shows you, in a light too clear to argue with, exactly how much room you were ever going to be allowed. And it hands you the choice, once and only once, of whether to keep begging for a bigger room in someone else's house, or go build your own. I chose the house. If you've ever been the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who was told to wait your turn while someone else's turn kept somehow lasting forever, I'd like to know. Tell me where you built your version of this house. I promise you I'm listening.